Picture this. You're a noblewoman in 1347, standing before your polished metal mirror as dawn breaks over your castle. Your lady-in-waiting approaches with a collection of ornate containers filled with what she promises will transform you into the epitome of medieval beauty. She opens the first jar, revealing a gleaming white paste that catches the candlelight like fresh snow. This is your daily face paint, a mixture so toxic it will slowly poison your blood, corrode your skin, and potentially kill you before your 30th birthday. But you smile and nod, because in medieval Europe, beauty isn't just vanity, it's survival. Your pale complexion will determine whether you attract a wealthy husband, maintain your social status, or face a life of disgrace and poverty. So you close your eyes as she begins applying the deadly concoction, unaware that each brushstroke is writing your death sentence in lead and mercury across your face. This was the horrifying reality for countless medieval women who paid the ultimate price for beauty. Their daily routines weren't just painful or uncomfortable, they were systematic acts of self-poisoning that society not only accepted, but demanded. Before diving into these forgotten stories of vanity and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters of beauty history together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the lengths people will go for perfection. To understand why medieval women willingly poisoned themselves daily, we must first understand the impossible position society placed them in. The medieval church condemned cosmetics as morally corrupt, to alter God's natural creation as a direct challenge to divine authority. Priests thundered from pulpits that painted faces were the devil's work, that rouge and powder marked a woman as spiritually fallen, potentially damning her soul for eternity. Yet the same society that demanded religious purity also required women to be beautiful enough to secure advantageous marriages. A woman's entire future, her wealth, protection, and survival depended on her ability to attract a husband. Plain faces meant poverty, ugly meant unmarriageable, and unmarriageable meant destitution, social exile, or life in a convent. This created an impossible paradox that medieval women had to navigate daily. They needed to look beautiful enough to catch a husband's eye, but not so obviously painted that they appeared sinful. The solution was the birth of what we might recognize today as the natural look, makeup so skillfully applied that it appeared to be God-given beauty rather than artificial enhancement. But achieving this natural look required ingredients so toxic. That modern scientists marvel at how anyone survived using them. The foundation of medieval beauty was literally built on poison. And the women who pursued it paid with their health, their sanity, and often their lives. The most coveted beauty standard of medieval Europe was porcelain white skin. This wasn't simply a matter of aesthetics. Pale skin was a powerful social marker that separated the nobility from the working classes. Peasant women who labored in fields developed tanned, weathered skin that marked them as common. Noble ladies who could afford to remain indoors displayed the milky complexion that proclaimed their elevated status to the world. But not every noblewoman was naturally blessed with the pale skin that society demanded. This is where medieval cosmetics entered the picture, and with them, a parade of horrors that would make modern toxicologists weep. The most popular face whitening cosmetic was called Venetian ceruse, and it was essentially a death sentence applied with a brush. This gleaming white paste was created by mixing white lead with vinegar, sometimes adding egg whites or rose water to improve the texture. The mixture was then formed into small, convenient balls that could be dissolved in liquid whenever a woman needed to refresh her deadly makeup. Lead as we now know, is one of the most dangerous heavy metals on Earth. Medieval women were essentially painting their faces with poison every single morning, allowing it to absorb through their skin directly into their bloodstream. The immediate effects might have seemed worth the risk. Ceruse provided a flawless marble-like complexion that lasted throughout the day and covered any blemishes or imperfections. But the long-term consequences were catastrophic. Women who used ceruse regularly developed what we now recognize as chronic lead poisoning. The symptoms began subtly: fatigue, headaches, slight tremors in the hands. But as the lead accumulated in their systems, the effects became impossible to ignore. Their hair began falling out in clumps, particularly around the hairline, creating the high foreheads that became fashionable, partly because so many noble women were going bald from their cosmetics. Their teeth turned black and began rotting in their mouths. Their skin, rather than remaining beautiful, became gray and mottled, requiring ever thicker applications of the very poison that was destroying it. The neurological effects were perhaps the most terrifying. Lead poisoning causes severe mental symptoms: confusion, memory loss, violent mood swings, and uncontrollable convulsions. Many women who were labeled as men dust their faces with arsenic powder as a finishing touch, unknowingly coating themselves in a substance that would slowly destroy their red blood cells and organs. The arsenic gave their skin a translucent, almost ethereal quality that was considered the height of beauty. But it also caused hair loss, kidney damage, and a wasting away of the body that, ironically, created the delicate, fragile appearance that medieval society found so attractive in noble ladies. The very poison that was killing them was also creating the aesthetic that society praised. Some cosmetic recipes took the toxicity to even more. One popular face whitening treatment combined lead, arsenic, and mercury, essentially creating a triple poison cocktail that women applied directly to their skin. The mercury added a slight luminescence to the complexion, making the skin appear to glow from within. What it actually did was accumulate in the brain and nervous system, causing tremors, personality changes, and eventual madness. The preparation of these cosmetics was as dangerous as their application. Women or their servants would grind lead compounds with mortar and pestle, breathing in clouds of toxic dust. They would heat mercury over open flames, inhaling the deadly vapors. The very act of creating these beauty products was slowly poisoning entire households. Yet the recipes were treated as precious secrets, passed down from mother to daughter like valuable family heirlooms. Noble women guarded their cosmetic formulas jealously, unaware that they were essentially sharing methods of mutual destruction. The most effective recipes, those that produced the most dramatic whitening effects, were naturally the most toxic, creating a deadly cycle where the most beautiful women were also the most poisoned. The social pressure to maintain these beauty standards was so intense that women continued using these toxic cosmetics even when they began experiencing obvious symptoms of poisoning. Court records from the period describe noble women who continued applying ceruse daily even as their hair fell out, their teeth blackened, and their hands shook uncontrollably. Some developed elaborate strategies to hide the symptoms of their cosmetic poisoning. They wore veils to conceal their hair loss, used fans to hide their trembling hands, and spoke in whispers to disguise the slurred speech that came with mercury poisoning. Rather than abandon their toxic beauty routines, they simply found ways to mask the evidence of what these routines were doing to them. The medical understanding of the time made the situation even more tragic. Medieval physicians recognized that certain cosmetics could be harmful, but they didn't understand the mechanism of heavy metal poisoning. They might recommend bloodletting or purging to treat the symptoms, never realizing that the daily application of lead and mercury was the root cause of their patients' mysterious illnesses. Texts even recommended cosmetic ingredients that we now know to be deadly. The famous Trotula, a medieval medical compendium focused on women's health, included recipes for face whiteners that contained lead, arsenic, and other toxic substances. These weren't the recommendations of ignorant charlatans, they were the official medical advice of the era's most respected physicians. The economic aspect of this toxic beauty industry was staggering. The most dangerous cosmetics were also the most expensive, creating a situation where wealth literally bought death. Poor women who couldn't afford Ceres might use chalk or flour to whiten their faces, substances that were harmless compared to the poison that wealthy women paid premium prices to apply. The irony was devastating. The women with the most resources, the best access to medical care, and the most privileged lives were systematically destroying themselves with luxury cosmetics, while their poorer sisters remained relatively safe with their simple, inexpensive alternatives. This economic dimension also meant that the toxic effects of medieval cosmetics were concentrated among the ruling classes. The very women who were supposed to produce heirs, govern territories, and maintain the stability of medieval society were slowly poisoning themselves into infertility, madness, and early death. The fertility consequences were particularly tragic. Lead and mercury both cause severe reproductive problems. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and birth defects were common among noble women who used these cosmetics regularly. Many royal bloodlines struggled with succession crises that may have been partly caused by the toxic beauty routines of their queens and princesses. Yet the connection between cosmetics and these health problems was rarely made. When a noblewoman suffered repeated miscarriages, physicians might blame her moral character, her diet, or divine displeasure. The idea that her daily beauty routine was destroying her ability to bear children was simply beyond their understanding. The social consequences rippled outward from individual tragedies to affect entire kingdoms. When queens and noble ladies died young or failed to produce healthy heirs, it created political instability that could last for generations. Wars were fought over succession crises that might have been prevented if medieval women hadn't been slowly poisoning themselves in pursuit of beauty. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of medieval cosmetic poisoning was how it was passed down through generations. Mothers who had suffered the effects of toxic cosmetics often insisted that their daughters follow the same deadly beauty routines, believing that the short-term social advantages outweighed the long-term health risks they didn't fully understand. Young girls, as early as 12 or 13, were introduced to Ceres and other toxic cosmetics as part of their preparation for marriage. They learned to apply these poisons with the same care that they learned embroidery or music as essential accomplishments for a lady of breeding. By the time they reached marriageable age, they had already been poisoning themselves for years. The cycle continued because the social structure demanded it. Each generation of women faced the same impossible choice: risk spiritual damnation and social condemnation by avoiding cosmetics, or risk physical poisoning and death by using them. The overwhelming majority chose the poison, creating a centuries-long epidemic of self-inflicted toxic exposure that society not only tolerated, but actively encouraged. This wasn't ignorance. It was systematic societal pressure that forced women to choose between social death and physical death, with many unknowingly choosing both. The pursuit of the perfect rouge was equally deadly, though medieval women approached it with the same enthusiasm they showed for their toxic face paint. Red cheeks and lips weren't just fashionable, they were considered essential signs of health and fertility that could make the difference between an advantageous marriage and spinsterhood. The most coveted red cosmetic was vermilion, a brilliant scarlet pigment that produced the kind of vibrant color that could be seen across a crowded great hall. What medieval women didn't understand was that vermilion was essentially powdered cinnabar, mercury sulfide, making their lip color a direct application of one of the most dangerous heavy metals known to humanity. Women would carefully paint vermilion onto their lips and cheeks, often applying multiple layers to achieve the desired intensity. The mercury absorbed directly through the delicate mucous membranes of their mouths, entering their bloodstream more efficiently than even the lead-based face paints. With every meal, every drink, every kiss, they were ingesting poison that accumulated in their brains and nervous systems. The symptoms of mercury poisoning from cosmetic rouge were particularly cruel because they developed so gradually. Women might notice that their hands trembled slightly when they embroidered, or that they had difficulty remembering conversations from the previous day. These subtle changes were easily dismissed as the natural weaknesses of the feminine temperament, exactly what medieval society expected from delicate noble ladies. But as the mercury continued to accumulate, the symptoms became impossible to ignore. Women developed what we now recognize as erethism, a condition that causes severe personality changes, anxiety, and social withdrawal. The very rouge that was supposed to make them more attractive in social situations was gradually destroying their ability to function socially at all. The most tragic cases involved women who became so psychologically damaged by mercury poisoning that they were confined to their chambers, considered too unstable for public appearance. Their families often interpreted this as a spiritual failing, inherited weakness, never suspecting that the beloved daughter or wife was slowly going insane from the cosmetics she had been taught to apply since childhood. Even more disturbing were the alternative rouge recipes that women used when vermilion was unavailable or too expensive. Some medieval cosmetic texts recommended using cochineal, crushed beetles mixed with animal fat, which was relatively harmless compared to the mercury-based alternatives. But other recipes called for red ochre mixed with lead compounds, or even stranger concoctions that combined toxic metals with organic materials in ways that multiplied their dangers. One particularly horrifying recipe involved mixing crushed red insects with white lead and mercury, creating a cosmetic that delivered multiple poisons simultaneously. Women who used this preparation were essentially painting their faces with a cocktail designed to destroy their nervous systems, blood cells, and organs all at once. The lip coloring process itself was an elaborate ritual that revealed just how normalized the self-poisoning had become. Noble ladies would carefully prepare their mouths by rubbing them with cut lemons to create a slightly abraded surface that would better hold the toxic pigments. The acid from the lemons created tiny wounds that allowed the mercury and lead to penetrate even more efficiently into their systems. They would then apply the vermilion with small brushes made from animal hair, building up layers of color with the same precision that artists use to create illuminated manuscripts. The process could take an hour or more, during which they were breathing in toxic vapors and absorbing poisons through their damaged lip tissue. Some women became so obsessed with achieving the perfect red that they would reapply their lip color multiple times throughout the day. Court records describe noble ladies who carried small containers of vermilion with them, touching up their makeup between meals, after conversations, whenever they felt their appearance might be less than perfect. Each application was another dose of mercury, steadily building toward the inevitable breakdown of their neurological systems. The social rituals surrounding rouge application created additional opportunities for poisoning. Noble ladies often applied their cosmetics in groups, chatting and gossiping while they painted their faces with toxic substances. The enclosed chambers where this took place became filled with mercury vapors that everyone present was breathing, creating a shared experience of gradual poisoning disguised as feminine bonding. Young ladies in waiting, often just children themselves, were trained to assist with these cosmetic rituals. They would grind pigments, mix compounds, and help apply the finished products, absorbing toxic substances through their skin and lungs. Many developed symptoms of heavy metal poisoning before they were old enough to understand what was happening to them. Economic pressures surrounding rouge were particularly vicious. The most vibrant, long-lasting red colors were also the most expensive and the most toxic. Poor imitations made with safer ingredients like crushed flowers or plant dyes were dismissed as inferior substitutes, suitable only for servants or peasants. Wealth bought access to the most dangerous cosmetics, creating a system where social status was literally measured by how much poison one could afford to apply to one's face. This economic hierarchy of toxicity meant that the highest-ranking women in medieval society, queens, duchesses, and countesses, were often the most severely poisoned. They had access to the purest mercury compounds, the finest lead preparations, and the most concentrated toxic pigments. Their privileged position in society came with the privilege of destroying themselves more efficiently than anyone else. The beauty standards themselves were shaped by the effects of this systematic poisoning. The trembling hands that resulted from mercury exposure became associated with feminine delicacy. The pale, wasted appearance caused by arsenic poisoning was praised as ethereal beauty. The personality changes brought on by heavy metal toxicity were interpreted as the mysterious, unpredictable nature that made women so fascinating to medieval men. Society was essentially using the symptoms of cosmetic poisoning as the definition of ideal femininity, creating a feedback loop where the more poisoned a woman became, the more beautiful she was considered to be. The sickest women received the most praise for their appearance, encouraging others to pursue the same toxic beauty routines with even greater dedication. The religious authorities who condemned cosmetics as sinful were in many ways trying to save women's lives, though they didn't understand the medical reasons behind their moral objections. The Church's opposition to face painting was based on theological grounds about vanity and pride, but the practical effect would have been to protect women from systematic heavy metal poisoning. However, the religious prohibition was so tangled up with concepts of sin and female sexuality that many women chose to risk damnation rather than appear in public with unadorned faces. They would confess their use of cosmetics as a spiritual failing while continuing to apply toxic substances daily, treating their beauty routine as a necessary sin rather than. Some developed elaborate justifications for their cosmetic use, arguing that God expected them to make the most of their natural gifts, or that maintaining their beauty was essential for fulfilling their duties as wives and mothers. These rationalizations allowed them to continue their toxic beauty routines while maintaining their sense of religious propriety. The confession records from medieval churches provide heartbreaking glimpses into the psychological torture that medieval women endured over their cosmetic choices. They would confess to vanity and pride while describing beauty routines that were literally killing them, seeking forgiveness for sins that were actually symptoms of a society that demanded they choose between social acceptance and physical survival. The medical texts of the period reveal the complete failure of medieval medicine to understand what was happening to these women. Physicians would prescribe bloodletting to treat the tremors caused by mercury poisoning, or recommend purging to address the digestive problems caused by lead absorption. Their treatments often made the poisoning worse, while never addressing the actual cause of their patients' mysterious ailments. Some medical authorities actually recommended cosmetic ingredients that we now know to be extremely dangerous. The Trocula, one of the most respected medical texts dealing with women's health, included recipes for rouge that contained mercury, lead, and arsenic. These weren't the suggestions of ignorant folk healers. They were the official recommendations of the era's most learned physicians. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that some medieval doctors were beginning to notice connections between cosmetics and health problems, but their observations were dismissed or ignored. A few medical texts warned against using certain pigments or recommended limiting the frequency of cosmetic application, but these cautious voices were overwhelmed by social pressure and economic interest. The cosmetic industry of medieval Europe was built on a foundation of systematic poisoning that everyone involved, manufacturers, physicians, users, and society at large, either didn't understand or chose to ignore. The result was centuries of unnecessary suffering and death that was not only tolerated, but actively encouraged by the beauty standards of the time. But rouge and face paint were only the beginning of medieval women's toxic beauty arsenal. The pursuit of the perfect complexion extended far beyond simple color, diving into practices that would horrify modern dermatologists and revealing the true depths of medieval society's willingness to sacrifice women's health for aesthetic ideals. The obsession with achieving flawless skin drove medieval women to embrace treatments that were essentially controlled chemical burns, disguised as beauty. The quest for perfection meant that any blemish, freckle, or sign of aging had to be eliminated through increasingly extreme measures that pushed the boundaries of what human skin could endure. One of the most popular skin treatments involved creating what medieval beauty texts called lifting compounds, mixtures designed to literally burn away the top layers of skin to reveal the supposedly perfect complexion beneath. These preparations typically combined onion juice or squill extract with various acids and caustic substances, creating a paste that would be applied to the face and left on until the skin began to blister. The process was agonizing. Women would lie still for hours while their faces burned, tears streaming from their eyes as the caustic mixture ate through layers of skin. The pain was so intense that many required doses of wine mixed with opium just to endure the treatment. Yet this torture was considered not just acceptable, but desirable, a necessary sacrifice for beauty that separated refined ladies from common women who couldn't afford such sophisticated skincare. The aftermath of these chemical peeling treatments was equally horrific. Women's faces would be raw and bleeding for days, requiring them to remain hidden in their chambers while their skin slowly healed. Many developed severe infections from the open wounds, leading to scarring that was far worse than any original blemishes they had hoped to eliminate. Some died from systemic infections that entered through their chemically burned faces. But even more disturbing were the ingredients that medieval women willingly rubbed into their open wounds during the healing process. Believing that certain substances would promote more beautiful skin growth, they would apply mixtures containing white lead, mercury compounds, and ground pearls to their raw, damaged faces. The toxic metals absorbed directly into their bloodstreams through the damaged tissue, creating a double assault of chemical burns, followed by heavy metal poisoning. The most extreme version of medieval skin treatment involved what was euphemistically called renewal therapy, a process that promised to completely regenerate a woman's complexion by destroying the existing skin entirely. This treatment used a combination of quicklime and orpiment, two substances so caustic that they could dissolve hair and burn through leather. The preparation of these renewal compounds was dangerous, even for the servants who mixed them. The recipes called for heating quicklime until it became intensely caustic, then adding orpiment, a toxic arsenic compound that released deadly vapors when heated. The resulting paste had to be applied quickly before it became too caustic to handle, creating a race against time that often resulted in severe burns for everyone involved. Women who underwent renewal therapy essentially had their faces destroyed and rebuilt from the ground up. The caustic mixture would burn away not just the top layer of skin, but often several layers deep, creating wounds that took weeks or months to heal. Many were left permanently disfigured by scarring that was far more obvious than any natural aging or blemishes they had started with. The psychological impact of these extreme skin treatments was devastating. Women would emerge from their healing chambers looking worse than when they started, their faces covered in scabs and scars. Yet they often blamed themselves for not following the treatment protocols correctly, or for not having the proper constitution to benefit. The idea that the treatments themselves were fundamentally flawed was rarely considered. Some medieval beauty texts acknowledged that these skin treatments were dangerous, but they framed the warnings in ways that actually encouraged more women to try them. One manual warned that renewal therapy should only be attempted by women of strong constitution and pure blood, essentially challenging readers to prove their worthiness by enduring the torture. Another text suggested that the pain and scarring were temporary prices to pay for eternal beauty. comparing the process to religious martyrdom. The social pressure surrounding these extreme skin treatments created a competitive atmosphere where women felt compelled to undergo increasingly dangerous procedures to maintain their status. Those who refused were often viewed as lacking dedication to their appearance or as being too weak to handle the demands of true beauty. The ability to endure chemical burns became a mark of aristocratic refinement. Young women were often introduced to these treatments gradually, starting with milder caustic substances and working their way up to more extreme formulations. By the time they realized the full horror of what they were doing to themselves, they were often too disfigured to appear in public without continuing the treatments. They became trapped in cycles of chemical assault that grew progressively more severe as their skin became more damaged and required stronger interventions. The economic aspect of extreme skin treatments created additional layers of exploitation. The most dangerous chemicals were often the most expensive, and women were charged premium prices for the privilege of having their faces destroyed by expert practitioners. Wealthy families would spend fortunes on renewal therapy for their daughters, viewing it as an investment in advantageous marriages that would more than repay the cost. The practitioners who performed these treatments were often former victims themselves, women who had survived the procedures and learned to inflict them on others. They developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies around the application of caustic substances, turning medical torture into a mysterious art that justified their high fees. Some claimed to have secret ingredients or special techniques that made their treatments more effective, when in reality they were simply using different combinations of the same toxic chemicals. The failure rate of these extreme skin treatments was staggering. Medical records from the period, though fragmentary, suggest that a significant percentage of women who underwent renewal therapy suffered permanent disfigurement, chronic health problems, or death from infection. Yet these statistics were rarely discussed openly, and the women who survived often felt compelled to praise the treatments publicly to avoid admitting they had made terrible mistakes. The most tragic cases involved women who became addicted to the process of skin destruction and renewal. Having destroyed their natural complexion with caustic chemicals, they became dependent on increasingly frequent and severe treatments to maintain any semblance of normal appearance. Some underwent renewal therapy multiple times per year, systematically destroying and rebuilding their faces in an endless cycle of self-inflicted torture. These extreme skin treatments also had devastating effects on medieval women's ability to express emotion or communicate effectively. The repeated chemical burns often damaged the muscles and nerves in their faces, leaving them with limited ability to smile, frown, or make the subtle facial expressions that were essential for social interaction. Many developed a frozen, mask-like appearance that was actually the result of nerve damage from caustic cosmetic treatments. The religious authorities who condemned cosmetics as sinful were horrified by these extreme skin treatments, viewing them as deliberate mutilation that violated God's creation. Some priests refused to give communion to women whose faces showed obvious signs of chemical burning, treating them as if they had committed acts of self-harm that put their souls in jeopardy. Yet even this religious opposition was often ineffective against the social pressure to undergo these procedures. The medical understanding of skin healing was so primitive during this period that many of the post-treatment care protocols actually made the damage worse. Women were often advised to keep their chemically burned faces exposed to air and sunlight, which increased scarring and infection risk. Others were told to apply additional toxic substances during the healing process, compounding the original damage with new layers of chemical assault. The long-term consequences of extreme medieval skin treatments extended far beyond cosmetic concerns. Women who survived multiple renewal therapies often developed chronic pain conditions, autoimmune disorders, and neurological problems that plagued them. The toxic chemicals they had absorbed through their damaged skin accumulated in their organs, causing systemic health problems that medieval medicine was completely unable to understand or treat. Perhaps most heartbreaking was how these extreme treatments were passed down through families as treasured beauty secrets. Mothers, who had survived chemical skin destruction, would insist that their daughters undergo the same procedures, viewing it as an essential part of their preparation for adult life. They would share recipes for caustic compounds and techniques for applying them, genuinely believing they were giving their daughters valuable advantages in life. The normalization of extreme skin treatments created a culture where women's pain and disfigurement were not just accepted, but celebrated as evidence of their dedication to beauty and social status. The ability to endure chemical burns became a mark of character, and women who refused, often viewed as lazy or vain in a different, more condemnable way. Yet, even as these extreme treatments were destroying women's faces and health, new innovations in medieval beauty were emerging that would prove even more dangerous. The quest for perfect hair removal would push the boundaries of self-inflicted torture to levels that seemed almost impossible to survive, revealing depths of desperation that challenge our understanding of what human beings will do in pursuit of social acceptance. The medieval obsession with hair removal reached levels of extremity that border on the incomprehensible, driven by beauty standards that demanded women achieve an almost prepubescent smoothness that defied natural human development. The fashionable ideal wasn't just hairless, it was aggressively, unnaturally bare in ways that required constant maintenance through methods that were essentially torture. The most coveted look among medieval noblewomen was the plain open face, a completely hairless expanse from the crown of the head down to the eyebrows, which were also completely removed. This created an alien, doll-like appearance that was considered the height of sophistication and breeding. Achieving this look required removing not just the obvious hair, but also the fine, barely visible hair that naturally covers human faces, creating a surface so unnaturally smooth that it seemed almost inhuman. The process began with the eyebrows, which had to be completely eliminated using tweezers made from various metals. But simple plucking wasn't sufficient for the medieval beauty ideal. The hair follicles themselves had to be destroyed to prevent regrowth. Women would heat thin metal pins until they glowed red hot, then carefully insert them into each individual hair follicle to burn it closed from the inside. The pain of this procedure was indescribable. Each heated pin created a tiny burn that penetrated deep into the sensitive facial skin, destroying not just the hair follicle, but often the surrounding tissue as well. Women would endure hundreds of these individual burns across their faces, tears streaming as they systematically destroyed their ability to grow natural facial hair. The smell of burning flesh would fill their chambers during these sessions, mixing with the acrid smoke from the heated metal implements. Servants often became nauseous from the combination of odors and sounds, the sizzling of flesh, the involuntary cries of pain, and the underlying scent of burned hair and skin that clung to everything in the room. But the eyebrow removal was just the beginning. The hairline had to be pushed back dramatically to create the fashionable, high forehead that signaled intelligence and breeding. This required removing several inches of natural hair growth, again using the heated pin method to ensure the hair would never return. Women would spend days having their hairlines systematically burned away, creating artificially high foreheads that often extended halfway back across their skulls. The process of hairline removal was particularly dangerous because of the proximity to the brain and major blood vessels. The heated pins would penetrate deeply into the scalp, sometimes causing infections that spread to the skull bone itself. Some women developed chronic headaches, while others suffered partial paralysis of facial muscles when the burning damaged the nerves running beneath their skin. Even more disturbing were the chemical depilatories that medieval women used when they couldn't endure the heated pin treatments. These mixtures combined quicklime with various toxic compounds to create pastes that would literally dissolve hair by burning it away at the most popular recipes combined quicklime with orpiment, the same arsenic compound used in extreme skin treatments, creating a substance so caustic it could eat through metal. The application of these chemical depilatories was a carefully choreographed dance with death. The mixture had to be applied quickly before it became too caustic to handle, then removed at precisely the right moment before it burned through the skin entirely. Women would lie motionless while the chemicals ate away their hair, feeling their skin burn and blister as the caustic paste did its work. The timing was critical and often miscalculated. Leave the depilatory on too long, and it would burn through the skin, leaving permanent scars or even exposing the bone beneath. Remove it too early, and the hair wouldn't be completely destroyed, requiring repeated applications that multiplied the damage. Many women bore the scars of miscalculated depilatory treatments for the rest of their lives. But perhaps the most nightmarish aspect of medieval depilatory treatment was the ingredients that some recipes required. One popular formulation called for cat feces to be dried, ground to powder, and mixed with vinegar to create a paste that was then applied to unwanted hair. Women would literally cover their faces with excrement, believing that the bacteria and acids in the waste would somehow dissolve their hair more effectively than other methods. The health consequences of applying animal waste to open wounds and damaged skin were catastrophic. Women developed severe infections that spread throughout their systems, causing fevers, delirium, and often death. The bacteria in the feces would enter through the tiny wounds created by the depilatory process, creating systemic infections that medieval medicine was powerless to treat. Other recipes called for equally disturbing ingredients: ground eggshells mixed with various acids, crushed insects combined with caustic metals, or plant extracts that had been allowed to rot until they developed toxic properties. Medieval women would apply these concoctions to their most sensitive facial areas, never understanding that they were essentially poisoning themselves through their skin. The reason of social pressure to maintain completely hairless faces meant that these treatments had to be repeated regularly. Hair removal wasn't a one-time procedure, but an ongoing torture that women endured throughout their adult lives. As soon as the slightest regrowth appeared, they would subject themselves to another round of burning, chemical assault, or bacterial infection. The economic exploitation surrounding hair removal was particularly cruel. The most effective depilatories were also the most expensive and the most dangerous. Wealthy women paid premium prices for the privilege of having their faces destroyed more thoroughly than their poorer counterparts. The ability to afford the most caustic chemicals became a status symbol, creating a hierarchy of self-destruction that paralleled the social hierarchy of medieval society. Professional hair removal practitioners developed elaborate techniques and tools that made the torture more efficient, but no less painful. They created specialized tweezers, heating devices, and application methods that allowed them to charge higher fees while inflicting more systematic damage. Some claimed to have secret techniques or special ingredients that made their services superior when, in reality, they were simply using different combinations of the same toxic and dangerous substances. The psychological impact of regular hair removal torture was devastating. Women lived in constant fear of regrowth, obsessively checking their faces for any sign of returning hair. The slightest shadow or texture change would send them into panic, driving them to seek immediate treatment, regardless of whether their skin had healed from the previous. They developed a form of body dysmorphia focused specifically on hair growth, seeing hair where none existed, and feeling compelled to undergo treatments even when their skin was already severely damaged. The obsession with hairlessness became a form of mental illness that drove women to destroy themselves in pursuit of an impossible ideal of smoothness. The tools used for hair removal were often crude and dangerous, increasing the likelihood of permanent damage. Tweezers made from inferior metals would break during use, leaving fragments embedded in the skin. Heating implements were difficult to control, often becoming too hot and causing deeper burns than intended. The chemical mixing processes were imprecise, leading to variations in caustic strength that could cause unexpected severe reactions. The medical texts that addressed hair removal were often more dangerous than helpful, providing recipes and techniques that increased rather than decreased the risks involved. The famous Trotula included detailed instructions for creating chemical depilatories that combined multiple toxic substances in ways that multiplied their dangerous effects. These weren't the recommendations of folk healers, but the official medical advice of respected physicians. The religious condemnation of excessive grooming created additional psychological torture for women who felt compelled to remove their hair. They would confess their vanity while continuing to undergo treatments that were destroying their health, trapped between religious guilt and social necessity. Some developed elaborate justifications for their hair removal practices, arguing that God expected them to present themselves in the most refined manner possible. The failure of medieval medicine to understand the connection between hair removal practices and the chronic health problems that plagued noble women meant that the real causes of their suffering were never addressed. Physicians would treat the symptoms, infections, scarring, nerve damage, without ever questioning whether the beauty practices themselves might be responsible for their patients' mysterious ailments. The most tragic cases involved women who became so disfigured by hair removal treatments that they could no longer appear in public, yet continued the practices in private, driven by an obsession with achieving perfect hairlessness, even when no one would ever see the results. They would spend their final years hidden away, systematically destroying what remained of their faces in pursuit of a beauty ideal that had already cost them everything that made life worth living. The final frontier of medieval beauty torture was perhaps the most intimate and psychologically devastating. The transformation of teeth from natural human features into artificial symbols of wealth and status. Medieval dental care wasn't about health or function. It was about creating a mouth that proclaimed your social position to anyone who saw you smile, regardless of the agony required to achieve it. The medieval ideal wasn't naturally white teeth. It was teeth so artificially altered that they appeared to be made of precious materials rather than human bone. Noble women would grind their teeth with pumice stone mixed with salt and honey, literally sanding away the enamel to create surfaces rough enough to hold the toxic whitening compounds they would apply daily. The grinding process itself was excruciating. Women would use abrasive pastes containing crushed marble, ground date pits, and pulverized animal bones, scrubbing their teeth until the enamel was completely worn away and the underlying dentin was exposed. The exposed nerves would cause constant, throbbing pain that made eating or drinking almost impossible. But this was considered a necessary sacrifice for the gleaming white smile that marked true nobility. Once the natural enamel was destroyed, women would apply whitening compounds that were essentially concentrated poison designed to bleach the remaining tooth structure. These preparations typically contained white lead mixed with various acids, creating a paste that would eat away at the tooth surface while depositing toxic metals directly into the oral cavity. Every time they spoke, ate, or drank, they were ingesting lead compounds that accumulated in their organs. The most extreme dental treatments involve completely replacing natural teeth with artificial substitutes made from ivory, animal teeth, or even teeth pulled from corpses. The extraction of healthy natural teeth was performed without any form of anesthesia, using crude metal tools that often shattered the teeth during removal, leaving infected fragments embedded in the gums. The artificial teeth were held in place with wire or metal clasps that created constant pressure and irritation. The foreign materials would cause chronic infections, and the metal fixtures would corrode in the acidic environment of the mouth, releasing additional toxic compounds directly into the bloodstream. Many women developed systemic poisoning from the metals used to anchor their artificial teeth. But even more disturbing was the source of replacement teeth. Wealthy women would purchase teeth from executed criminals, plague victims, or battlefield casualties, having these disease-ridden remains implanted directly into their own mouths. The risk of infection was enormous, and many developed gangrene or other serious diseases from the contaminated teeth they had paid premium prices to install. The dental whitening compounds were applied daily, often multiple times per day, creating a constant cycle of chemical assault on whatever remained of their natural teeth. The preparations would burn the gums and tongue, causing ulcers and lesions that made speaking or eating. Yet women would continue these applications faithfully, viewing the pain as evidence that the treatments were working effectively. Some medieval dental recipes reached levels of complexity that rivaled the most dangerous cosmetic preparations. One popular formula combined cinnamon, clove, frankincense, and ground crab shells with white lead and mercury compounds, creating a paste that delivered multiple toxins simultaneously while promising to whiten teeth and sweeten breath. The mercury would cause neurological damage, while the lead destroyed the blood cells, and the acid from the organic ingredients would eat away at the remaining tooth structure. The economic exploitation surrounding dental treatments was particularly cruel because teeth were visible indicators of wealth that couldn't be hidden. Women who couldn't afford the most extreme treatments were immediately marked as inferior, creating intense pressure to undergo procedures that often cost more than entire households earned in a year. Some families would bankrupt themselves to provide their daughters with the artificial smiles that might secure advantageous marriages. The social rituals surrounding dental care created additional opportunities for poisoning and infection. Noble ladies would gather to apply their whitening compounds together, sharing contaminated implements and creating clouds of toxic vapors that everyone present would inhale. These dental care sessions became social events where women would compete to see who could endure the most extreme treatments. The psychological impact of medieval dental torture was particularly devastating because it affected women's ability to speak, eat, and express themselves naturally. The very treatments designed to make them more attractive often left them unable to participate normally in social situations. The medical texts addressing dental care were often more concerned with achieving dramatic visual results than preserving function or health. The trotula included detailed recipes for tooth whitening that combined multiple toxic substances in ways that maximized their destructive potential. These recommendations came from respected medical authorities, giving women false confidence that their dental torture was both safe and scientifically sound. As we reach the end of this journey through medieval beauty horror, we must confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature and social pressure. These weren't isolated incidents of individual vanity gone wrong. They were systematic societal failures that sacrificed generations of women on the altar of impossible beauty standards. The women whose stories we've explored weren't weak or foolish. They were responding rationally to the impossible choices their society presented them. In a world where a woman's survival depended entirely on her ability to attract and keep a husband, where beauty was literally a matter of life and death, the decision to risk poisoning seemed logical compared to the certainty of social and economic destruction. What makes these stories so haunting isn't just the individual suffering they represent, but what they reveal about the capacity of civilized societies to normalize and celebrate systematic cruelty when it serves existing power structures. Medieval Europe created beauty standards that were literally impossible to achieve safely, then condemned women who failed to meet them, while celebrating those who destroyed themselves in the attempt. The toxic cosmetics industry of medieval Europe generated enormous profits for those who manufactured and sold these deadly products. Merchants became wealthy selling lead and mercury compounds to women who didn't understand they were purchasing their own deaths. Physicians built careers treating the mysterious ailments that plagued noble ladies, never acknowledging that they were profiting from conditions caused by the very treatments they recommended. The religious authorities who condemned cosmetics as sinful were, in many ways, the only voices trying to protect women from this systematic poisoning, though their motivations were theological rather than medical. Yet even their opposition was often ineffective against economic interests and social pressure that made beauty. Torture seemed not just acceptable, but necessary. The legacy of medieval beauty practices extends far beyond the individual tragedies they created. These toxic traditions establish patterns of thinking about women's bodies and their value that persist in different forms today. The idea that women should be willing to endure pain, risk their health, and sacrifice their well-being for appearance remains embedded in cultural expectations that continue to cause suffering. Modern cosmetics may be safer than medieval lead paint and mercury rouge, but the underlying premise remains unchanged, that women's natural appearance is inadequate and requires constant modification to be acceptable. The specific methods have evolved, but the psychological pressure to transform oneself through potentially harmful means continues to shape women's choices and experiences. The economic exploitation has also evolved, rather than disappeared. Today's beauty industry generates billions of dollars by convincing women that their natural appearance requires improvement, using sophisticated marketing techniques that medieval merchants could never have imagined. The profits still flow primarily to those who manufacture and sell beauty products, while the costs and risks are borne by the women who use them. Perhaps most importantly, these medieval stories remind us that beauty standards are not natural or inevitable. They are artificial constructions that serve the interests of those who benefit from women's insecurity and desperation. The medieval obsession with pale skin, hairless faces, and artificially whitened teeth wasn't based on any objective measure of attractiveness. It was a system designed to demonstrate wealth, status, and submission to social authority. The women who suffered through these beauty rituals were victims of a culture that valued their appearance more than their humanity, their social function more than their individual welfare. They deserve to be remembered, not as cautionary tales about vanity, but as casualties of a system that was fundamentally designed to exploit and destroy them. Understanding these historical patterns of beauty-related suffering can help us recognize similar dynamics in our own time and make more informed choices about the pressures we accept and the standards we pursue. The medieval women who painted their faces with poison and burned away their hair weren't fundamentally different from us. They were human beings trying to survive in a world that gave them impossible choices. Their stories echo across the centuries as a reminder that the pursuit of beauty becomes monstrous when it demands the sacrifice of health, happiness, and humanity itself. In honoring their memory, we must commit to creating a world where no one is forced to choose between social acceptance and physical, where beauty enhances rather than destroys life, and where the value of human beings is measured by something deeper than their erect willingness to endure suffering for the sake of appearance. The nightmare of medieval beauty may have ended, but its lessons remain as relevant today as they were 7 centuries ago. The price of ignoring those lessons is measured not just in individual suffering, but in the countless lives that continue to be diminished by the persistent belief that a woman's worth lies primarily in her ability to transform herself into something other than what nature intended.